And my dad had got this dream that he would send his daughters to university because he never got. The female that I worked for, it was a big organisation, and she joined it at a very junior level when her father was actually quite a senior manager in the organisation. And I kind of always wondered whether there was a bit of a confidence gap. I realised what sits behind micromanagement. I think it became an awful lot easier to coach managers out of it, because I think fundamentally it stems from fear. And we were sent away for a week-long residential to learn how to be managers, and we were then put into action learning sets for the next, I can't remember if it was 1 or 2. I often hear managers saying, well, I used to travel all over the country when I was looking for promotion. Why don't they? Working environment is one of those things that it's not a motivator in itself.
Welcome to another exciting episode of the Leading Boldly podcast. I'm Matt Clutterham.
I'm Jenny Jarvis.
Today we have a very special guest who has dedicated her career to transforming the way we manage people in the UK. She's a seasoned HR expert, a celebrated coach, and the author of The Accidental Manager, Marion Parrish. Marion's journey includes key HR roles at BT, AIG, Boots, and the Learning and Skills Council. Before becoming the Accidental Manager coach, Marion spent 10 years delivering ILM qualifications to managers across various industries. She believes that understanding the right working environment and HR framework can transform morale and productivity. Marion helps accidental managers take control, set routines, spot triggers, recruit effectively, handle tough conversations, manage performance, and delegate confidently. And don't we all need to do that in our business and our lives? If you're ready to improve your people management skills, stay tuned for this invaluable, actionable insights. Marion, welcome to the Leading Boldly podcast.
Thank you very much for having me.
Oh, Marian, it's great to have you here. You're one of our wonderful networking connections. We met on a networking and we saw your book and we thought you are someone that can really add value to our Leading Boldly audience. So I'm going to dive straight in with, what was childhood like for you? Were you always interested in people and management? Were you the one in the playground managing everybody? What was your journey like to management?
I think I've always liked to tell people where they're going wrong in their lives. So I think probably as a child I was, perhaps these days we might refer to them as leadership skills, but maybe back then, I knew what I wanted and how I thought people should do things.
Were you called bossy quite a lot? Maybe.
From time to time. But actually, in many ways, I was a very quiet child, actually. And I spent a lot of time just observing people's behaviour and the way people were. I think I always wanted to do something in life where I could either teach people or look after them. So I thought I wanted to either be a teacher or a nurse, which I think a lot of little girls probably go through that spell. And my dad was self-employed. So he was a self-employed driving instructor throughout my childhood. And he always said to me, don't ever work for yourself. It's a terrible thing to do. Don't ever do it. Don't ever do it. And of course, I'm a very obedient daughter, so I didn't.
Isn't it interesting?
Yeah, absolutely. Whatever you tell somebody not to do, that's what they're going to want to do more than anything else.
So what made you choose to go into, was it, I had it written down somewhere actually, when you went to university, what made you choose your options? Tell us about your options.
Well, I guess when I got to the end of my A-levels, I didn't really quite know what I wanted to do. I actually wanted to go and work in a retail manager. I wanted to be a retail manager in a big supermarket, and I was offered the opportunity to apply for a management training scheme at the place where I had my Saturday job, which was Gateway Food Markets, which you might remember from many, many years ago. And my dad had got this dream that he would send his daughters to university because he never got to go. So there ensued some family disputes, which he won. And I ended up trying to work out which of my English, French and economics A-levels I was going to try and pursue. And I wasn't that good at French, if I'm honest, but I did enjoy it. I did enjoy economics as well. I didn't like English literature. It put me off reading for a long, long time after I did it. I think I came out with an awful lot of mental blocks, shall we say, to reading. Having tried to read Bleak House 3 times in 2 years, it was not a good experience. So I wanted to do something businessy, and originally I had applied to do management studies and French, and I didn't quite get the grade in French that I needed. So I was offered a place on a course called Managerial Sciences, which sounded really good. It was really, really and truly, it was business studies with a bit of IT added on, because this was the late 80s and, you know, nobody really quite knew where we were going with information technology, but we knew it was something. So I kind of landed there a little bit by accident, but it was on that degree, I think, that I first kind of really developed an interest in psychology, in industrial relations, and in some of the things around sort of marketing, but persuading people, communicating with people, and really trying to get the best out of people. So I think that's really where it started.
I really want to point out a really fascinating bit to that, just for our listeners and our watchers, particularly anyone who wants to write a book, who has an ambition to write a book, but thinks, oh my God, I can't because I was rubbish at English at school and I really hated it. We've literally got a celebrated author sat with us who didn't get on with English literature in education. So let that be some inspiration to crack on with that book. Sorry, Marion, I interrupted you. Please carry on.
You're absolutely right. And I think, you know, to be fair, I did get a decent A level in English, but I just didn't enjoy the reading bit. But I've always had a bit of a thing for writing as well. I think in terms of the managerial sciences, I was kind of unlucky and kind of lucky. At the end of my degree, we were having what was then called the worst graduate job market recession that the UK had ever seen. So it was really hard to actually find a graduate job, and I struggled and I couldn't find what I was looking for. And I landed in an agency role with BT, having been told by, you know, our university professors that the worst thing you could possibly do is go temping. I once again ignored all the advice and went temping. But I landed in BT and I did a couple of roles in BT. And in the second one, I found myself working for the person who was eventually going to stick the neck out and try and get me recruited into BT at the point where they had got a recruitment ban on. They were going through something called Project Sovereign, which the older people amongst your audience might remember as one of the biggest shedding of employees that any British employer had undertaken up to that point. And I started working there, and it was going into that very first HR role. It was personnel back in the day. Going into that very first personnel role, I really started to sort of see the fascination and really understand what a career working with people could really be like.
Yeah, and I think it's one of those things that some people love it and others hate it. Like some people say never work with children, animals, and people in general.
Absolutely.
And then others, like myself, it's all about the people. And I love your passion for improving people management, because that's what I'm all about too. So what drives this passion? How do you keep it alive after 30 years in the field?
I think that the passion comes from the contrast I had between a couple of managers very early in my career. And I can still feel the difference in the way I felt and behaved with both of those managers. So the first one was very empowering. He believed that everybody should be developed to the point that they couldn't be developed any further. And he sort of committed himself to doing that. He took risks, so he would give people responsibilities that they probably shouldn't have had in their jobs, and he gave me quite a few of those as well. And I always remember him saying, you know, one day I'll probably work for you, you know, that's the way it will be, but I want you to sort of, you know, grow and develop. And a bit later on, I went to work for a different manager who essentially in the first couple of days in the job basically said to me, you're no good to me until you understand all our processes inside and out. So you need to sit in this room with all these big manuals and don't come out until you've read them and understood them. And that was like, really? This is a blue chip organization, and this is how you're treating somebody who's, you know, come to you with all these skills that you were so keen to have. And then I kind of, after about 3 days, I said, like, is there anything I can do for you? Because I feel I've got my head around all of this now. I feel I understand what I need to do. And, oh, yes. Well, we've got a project to update the staff handbook. So that's fabulous. It's something I can actually get my teeth into. And she gave me this copy of the existing staff handbook, and I opened it, and she'd actually made all the changes herself. She really just wanted me to copy type it. So I'd gone from a job where I was kind of writing policies and teaching managers how to lead their teams into a copy typing role. And it was kind of like, really? Is this
What
is
do you
how?
think made the difference between those two? Because I mean, it's notable that one was the male and one was the female, and it was the female that wasn't particularly supportive.
Mhm.
Do you think there is a difference between male and female managers and the way they do things, or is it just a personality type?
I think there were two things in those cases, and from all the reflection I've done, and there was a lot. I think one of them, actually, the male had actually got a lot of education. He'd got a lot of education behind him. He'd got degrees, he'd got postgraduate qualifications, he'd been a teacher, he'd got management qualifications as well. The female that I worked for, it was a big organization, and she joined it at a very junior level when her father was actually quite a senior manager in the organization. And I kind of always wondered whether there was a bit of a confidence gap in terms of, she didn't necessarily, or she felt she got something to prove. And she felt she was perhaps being compared to her parent, and maybe that affected the way that she managed. But she was someone who just had to control everything. And she literally would, you couldn't breathe, you couldn't do anything without her say so. And it was a really stifling environment to try and work in.
Yeah, I'm guessing that there was probably quite a lot of modeling going on there as well from how she was treated when she first came into the business, which we see, don't we?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, as somebody who was the daughter starting off as the junior secretary with the director dad, I always had to work 10 times harder than anybody else to make things work, because everybody was looking at me for evidence that I earned my job. At 18, my dad got me a 2-week position there as a fill-in, and he never asked me back. He said to everyone else, if you want her back, you're going to now have to ask. And I was there in the end for 12 years on and off. And I did well for myself, but it is quite tough being the director's daughter, because you do have all eyes on you, and you do have to sort of almost prove your position. So you may not be wrong in that assumption.
I think so. I think it's, for me, the real sort of impact was in how I felt and what I was willing then to do. So with my first manager, I had been prepared to put in so much additional discretionary effort to do well, to impress, to sort of show that I was, capable of doing what I was being asked to do and more. And then I found myself in with the second manager just shutting down almost, just kind of working out, how can I do the minimum, what is the bare minimum I need to do to stay in a job? How late can I turn up and still, not get into trouble? How early can I go home? How long can I take for lunch and get away with it? And as I go through, these days now, when I sort of walk into organisations now, I can look around and kind of see the people that are in that position, and who are kind of sitting there hunched over and really not very interested and just kind of coasting. And I think that's what drives me. It's that waste of passion and productivity and profit in organisations who have got these really expensive resources that are quite often sitting around not doing very much, or certainly not as much as they're capable of doing, that could really transform your organisation.
I've been in organisations like that too. What do you think happens at the very senior level when you've got sort of senior managers who are in that position too? They're just sort of sat back going, well, I'm a senior manager, I'm just going to swing in my chair for a bit. And then you've got the people above them that they know that's going on, but they just leave it. Like, what's happening there?
It's too difficult. Quite often it's too difficult to have the conversation, to actually look somebody in the eye and say to them, we're not happy with the way that you're performing. There's a fear of what the repercussions might be within the rest of the team. So particularly if the coasting manager is quite popular with their team, there's a real fear that you're going to upset some of your better performers in the team by taking steps. And I think really as large organisations, we're just not really aware and recognizing the good that great HR can do, that great people management can do. If you can really tap into each of the people that work for you, work out what it is that lights them up and makes them want to succeed, and give them that in bucketfuls every day, your business could be doubling, tripling its turnover. I'm quite confident you could double or triple your turnover in 2 or 3 years' time, because at the moment you've just got some very expensive machinery essentially sitting around doing nothing, and we wouldn't tolerate it if it was machinery, and yet we accept it when it's people.
The HR department often comes with the roll of the eyes next to it. How can we change that?
I think my profession has an awful lot to hold itself accountable for, really. I think we tie ourselves up in very long, convoluted procedures and processes that don't really help the organisation to achieve what it wants to achieve. We're not helped by an employment law framework that's frankly a bit out of date and quite difficult to sort of work your way through if you're a pragmatic, commercially focused business person who just wants to get results. But I don't think we're great at training our HR professionals. I don't think the training's really moved on an awful lot in the last sort of 20 odd years since I did my training. It's still very much about process, about treating everyone the same, doing everything according to the letter and of the law. And the real world isn't quite like that.
Yeah, I've got a couple of questions around that, and it's a slight tangent, but I think this is a good place to ask it. So, our listeners and watchers will know that we deal a lot with brand, and one of the things that has always struck me about HR is actually some of the names around it. So, I personally feel like HR, like human resources, it has quite a negative tone for me. It does sound like we're talking about machinery and not people. And there's actually a term that I've seen a lot of the big business consultancy firms using, which I find even worse. I find quite abhorrent, which is human capital.
Yeah.
How do you feel about the names? And do you think that is an issue within the industry, or
is there a better name?
Yeah.
Well, so I can remember when personnel became human resources, and I think a lot of the talking at that time was really about how to make better use of your assets. So really, it was about putting people into a similar bucket in many ways to your machinery, your spare capital that you've got lying around, you spend money in the bank and whatever, and how are you going to get the most out of the people that you employ, that resource that you have available to your organisation. And I do think to a large extent we have dehumanised the actual individuals that work in organisations, not in every organisation, but it has swung too far that way. And I think the economic climate didn't help, because there were, until very recently, there were more people looking for jobs than there were jobs available. So employers could very much depersonalize the whole process, really, because they just needed people on seats, and if you couldn't do the job, then they could go back and find somebody tomorrow who could do a better job for you. I think there is has been a bit of a tide turning. I think the pandemic had probably sort of accelerated that to some extent, but I do see a lot of organizations now who talk about having a chief people officer. I'm not sure that's brilliant either, but I think it does bring the sort of focus back onto the fact they are human beings that we're working with. They are people. They are just like us. They may not have the same qualifications. They may not be working at the same level as us, but they're all people. They've all got lives outside of work. They've all got, ambitions and interests and hobbies and families and friends and everything that's about them that isn't the person that comes to work for those 7 or 8 hours a day. And we need to get back to remembering that bit, because that's more
really interesting. Yeah, really interesting, and really interesting to hear the history behind the names as well, because no one's quite explained it to me like that before. It's just names that we know. So yeah.
It always makes me laugh when we go onto LinkedIn, particularly, and it's got like the people, whatever it is, and it gives me a giggle every time. It's still of the, you mean HR?
Yeah. I think one of the other
day.
drivers, one of the reasons in the profession why we wanted to call it human resources was because I think the personnel function, that people function, has always been seen as perhaps less important than finance or marketing or sales. And perhaps calling it something a bit more commercially aware might get us a seat on the board table, around the board table. Doesn't always work that way, because actually the person who's doing that job has to actually be commercially aware and be able to give commercially focused people solutions.
And they have to be really
role.
positive about people as well. And
Definitely.
you are one of those managers who is positive about people, but lots of people, a bit like teachers, go into HR and they don't really like people.
Yeah, definitely.
It's mad. Teachers going to teaching, they don't really like kids, but
although my first boss, though, the one I was lauding earlier on, he used to have a saying which was, if you want to work, if you like people and you want to work with people, go be an air hostess, don't come to HR.
Yeah, exactly, because a lot of it is more paperwork.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah.
You've worked with some huge blue chip companies, BT, AIG, Boots. How have your experiences within those businesses, the large blue chip corporates, shaped what you do now?
I think there's a lot of things that are taken for granted in large blue chips that small businesses just don't really understand the value of. So in every blue chip I worked for, I would expect to have a one-to-one at least once a month with my manager. That was a non-negotiable, an hour once a month to talk about how I was doing, what I needed to be focusing on in the next month or so, and what support I could have or access to it to enable me to do that. They were also a lot better. I would always would have expected to have had a team meeting every month. And I think when I worked in BT, and BT were particularly good at communication. They were so huge, they had to be. But they would have every month what they called a core brief. So every single level in the organisation would talk about the same 3 or 4 topics in their team meetings that month. And the core brief would come down on a sheet of paper, and you'd kind of adapt it to the team you were working in. And then when you delivered the core brief, every team manager had to write down 2 or 3 bits of feedback from the meeting, and it went back up the line to the senior managers. So they've got that sort of toing and froing of communication, which
I love that BT was great with communication.
Well, they had to be, didn't they? I mean, that's the thing.
Such a great brand promise. They fulfilled.
But I think it was also interesting that that the manager I really got on with. I worked with him at BT and a couple of other organisations as well. But even sort of 10 years after we'd left BT, he would say they were years ahead. They were years ahead of the game, in their approach to managing people, to dealing with things like new legislation. They would plan for it. They would know that I was there when the Disability Discrimination Act was being put through Parliament, and BT had enacted things years before it was actually the law, because they wanted to do it in their own way, at their own pace, in a way that fitted with their business needs. And that forward thinkingness, and that communication, that way of actually making sure that everybody was focused on what they needed to do in their role to achieve the organisation's goals. I think there are 2 things that I just don't translate quite as well into small businesses, and yet it should be so much easier in a small business to communicate.
Yeah, it's really interesting, because we see exactly the same thing happening on the brand side. I've worked with big blue chip brands on their brand and their connection, and what I say to the smaller clients is, it's not about $1 million marketing budgets. The big brands just think a different way to you. And if we can get you to think the same way and act the same way, regardless of the budget, it's going to have a massive impact. So it's fascinating to hear that parallels with the human side.
Yeah, I want to go back to BT and the branding again, though, because my favourite bit of branding was Maureen Lipman. It's got a G.
Yeah.
He's got a G, Grandma. I failed all my exams. No, he got an ology. That was like, how many years ago was that? 20, 30?
Several. Yes.
Yeah,
Several.
decades.
Yes.
And I still remember that. It was great piece of branding there.
So, Marian, you've dealt with your fair share of micromanagers over the last few decades. How has that sort of inspired and changed your approach to coaching?
I think when I realised what sits behind micromanagement, I think it became an awful lot easier to coach managers out of it, because I think fundamentally it stems from fear. There's a fear of letting go of control in case the person that I've given this work to do doesn't do it the way I wanted it done, on time, to the standard that, you know, is acceptable, and I'm going to be in trouble for it. And that fundamentally sits at the bottom of most of micromanagement behavior, I think. So I think knowing that that's where it comes from makes it a lot easier to coach somebody out of it, because you can start teaching them ways that they can maintain the control that they need, the reassurance that they need that the job's going to be done properly, without having to actually watch somebody or you know, disempower somebody from actually doing what they're capable of doing. I guess the most micromanaging micromanager I worked for, who used to correct my spelling but make them incorrect, was probably my inspiration for all of this. But it's that kind of like, you know, working out as a manager, you've only got a finite amount of time and a finite amount of energy, and you really ought to be focusing it on the things that are going to make a difference, not on, you know, whether somebody's italicized something that they shouldn't have italicized, or, you know, whether they've spelt separate correctly or incorrectly, or correctly but you're going to make it incorrect now, or whatever it is. You know, there are some battles that are worth winning as a manager, and there are some battles that really aren't worth the energy. And micromanagement takes up so much energy, so much time, and it actually just stops you from being able to deliver your own job effectively.
I agree. And I think that probably is a parental thing as well. I think a lot of them will have had parents who were micromanagers, or conversely weren't, but they never knew what they were doing as kids and they got into trouble for everything. So as adults, they go up going, I don't want to do that to the people I'm around. So therefore, I'm going to help them at every step of the way. And it's, you know, it's I've seen it in my circles where people have been micromanaged as kids, and then as they get older, they become micromanagers, and you're like, yes, I see where that's from.
It's there are definitely some of our audience watching and listening right now who are going, I think I've been doing that. I think that's me. Have you got any real sort of quick top tips, that stuff that they can change today?
I think I would always say to any manager, before you start doing anything, is to take a step back and really ask yourself, what is this person's role and what is my role? You know, what are the differences between our responsibilities? Because if you're spending all your time micromanaging someone who's quite capable of doing the responsibilities within their job, you are not spending time delivering your own objectives or your own job responsibilities. So you're making them look good and you're looking really bad, essentially. So they're going to keep their job, you're going to lose yours if somebody's got to go, because they look like they're achieving everything. And I think when you can take that step back and say, well, hold on a minute, if they're underperforming, I need to manage them as an underperformer. If they're actually capable of doing the job, I'm wasting money by devoting my time to overseeing them when they could actually do an awful lot more of this job without my help. Or interference, whichever way you want to call it.
I want to dive a bit into the book, actually. So what led you firstly to write The Accidental Manager, and what do you hope that the readers will take away from the book?
I guess I've always had a bit of a thing I always wanted to write a book. And, you know, when you move in networking circles, as we all do, you know, lots of people write books, and some of those books are really, really good, and some of them not so much. And I just thought, you know, I've got something to add here. I can't coach every single manager in the UK. I don't have the time or the energy, but I do think, you know, having coached quite a lot, and worked in HR for so many years, I've seen so many different mistakes that managers make, and they really all fit into very, there's also almost a step-by-step set of things you can do that would prevent those things from happening. So I've kind of I thought, well, I can put this into a book. I can make it a book. And it turned into, I did start writing it probably about 2018, and then I shelved it. Partly because I'd gone into it, a bit like most managers go into the new management job with absolutely no idea how to write a book. And I thought it was dead easy. You just started typing and that was it. And I spent more of my time editing than I did actually writing anything. So I took a bit of a break from that. And I actually went and tried to find out how to write a book from people that had written books. So I went and read read blogs and listened to podcasts, and kind of understood then that there is a process for writing, there's a process of editing, there's a process of, second editing and what have you. And actually structuring a book's a really good idea to start with, because it really helps you write the book. And so I spent a year or so kind of absorbing all of this. And then when it got to the pandemic, I spent the first 2 lockdowns putting people on furlough and taking them off of furlough, and kind of helping, managers to try to get their businesses through what was a pretty awful time. And the 3rd lockdown, I thought, I need to have something to show for this. All these other people have transformed their houses, they've decluttered everything, they've learnt new skills, they've done all sorts of things, and I've done nothing. What can I do? And so I thought, I'm going to get that book out, and I am going to finish that book. And so it became my lockdown project to finish the book. So I did finish the first draft of it before the first lockdown ended. So the 3rd lockdown ended. So I was. And
did you get someone else to edit it?
No, I actually self-edited. I did get some other proofreaders, so I did have some input from outside, but I did it myself. Whether that was a good thing or a bad thing, I'm not so sure. But it was an experience.
People do.
Absolutely.
I'm just on 2nd edit of my book, so it should be out in September. I'll use you for inspiration, Marion. It's a bit like you. I started it over a year ago, and I keep thinking, must get this finished.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the book's called The Accidental Manager.
It's called, it's actually called, I've got a copy here. So it's actually called Step Up, The Accidental Manager's Guide to Leading a Team.
Move it in front of you a bit, because it's gone into your background.
Yeah.
We will put a link to it in the show notes anyway.
Thank you.
So can we discuss the concept of accidental manager?
Yeah, sure.
How common do you think that is? How does it happen, and how do organizations deal with it? There's a lot of questions there for you.
Well, main research on this has been done by the Chartered Management Institute. So the most recent research that I've seen suggests that 82% of new managers have had no formal management training whatsoever when they start their new job. And added on to that, 1 in 4 employers don't offer any sort of leadership training to new managers either. And I think that's probably a bit of an overestimate, actually, because I suspect that far fewer new managers get offered training. So I think, it comes about because you've got it's particularly in small organisations. I think it happens more often in small organisations. Budgets are fairly limited. You have a team around you that perhaps have worked with you from day one. You've got one individual who's consistently been better than everybody else in the team. And at the point where you decide you need another manager in the business, they're your automatic choice. You just go, the best performer, let's put them in to a management job. And that individual is then faced with a dilemma, because they don't have the skills or the knowledge of how to be a good manager other than what they've experienced themselves. And they've just lost the best person in their team, the best performing person in their team, because it's them. And now suddenly the team's underperforming. If it's like most organisations, they haven't recruited a replacement for that individual either. So productivity is already down, and they're already starting in a position that any manager would find difficult to kind of claw back from.
And they're supposed to be grateful for the opportunity too.
Absolutely. And they're probably not being paid a great deal more than the people that they're managing either. So it's, when I think back to my early career, and again, it's back to BT, and, they did things very well, but they promoted me into my first management job. And we were sent away for a week-long residential to learn how to be managers. And we were then put into action learning sets for the next, I can't remember if it was 1 or 2 years, but where we got together every sort of 6 or 8 weeks with other new managers, and we talked about some of the challenges that we had and how we'd all tackled these different challenges. So it was almost like a long learning process, really. And that, you know, I'd also got a qualification in management as well, and I did a postgraduate diploma in people management. I've got management qualifications coming out of my ears. So to go into an organisation and to see somebody who's expected to just pick up the reins and know what to do and how to manage some quite difficult scenarios, I think if we really stood back and thought about that, that's just ridiculous. It's like giving someone the keys to a car and just saying, off you go, just drive it. Don't worry about driving lessons. You'll pick it up. Everybody does. You know, it'll be fine.
Yeah, really interesting. It actually happened to me right at the beginning of my career. I was working for a large theatrical group across the UK, and I was working in a particular venue at quite a junior level, and they'd obviously seen something in me that they appreciated, and they literally took me out and put me into a struggling venue in the West End and basically said, turn the venue around. And you know, within my sort of department. And so suddenly I went from quite a junior role to not only having to turn an organization round, but actually lead the very disgruntled team that were already there.
Yeah. And you must have been quite young then.
I was really young, and they provided an element of management training. I think I had 4 days in a room in Woking, looking at some PowerPoint slides.
You did well.
But yes, it didn't prepare me for actually being on the ground and having to deal with it day to day. It was quite a steep learning curve.
I've had some hilarious moments too, where I've been asked in appraisals to upward manage my senior managers as in a minimum wage job. And I'm like, no, I'm here for an easy life because I've got other things to manage at home. I'm not upward managing. What are your thoughts on upward managing?
I have to say it's usually one of the topics I cover when I coach people, but it's not so much necessarily managing your manager, but it's really trying to understand how your manager works and how you can therefore get the best from that relationship. So, you know, I mean, I've talked to managers before who sort of said, oh, you know, I spent weeks doing this like really long paper for my manager on, you know, these changes that I wanted to put in place. And they just kind of flung it down on the desk and said, right, just give me the highlights. Okay, so let's think about how that manager thinks. You know, you might like to think in detail and think they want lots of energy, but actually if you talked in advance about what their expectations are, what they need to be able to make a decision, could you save yourself a bit of time, do you think? You know, do you think you could come out with something that's much more satisfying to you and easier for your manager to manage as well? So I think that managing it I always remember when I was delivering training, this lady said to me, I need some help with my boss. I just can't cope with her. She said, I come into work every morning at 9 o'clock. I sit down and I get started on the most important thing on my to-do list. She said, and every morning at 9:10 on the dot, my manager comes and sits on my desk and gives me a whole load more work to do. And and it's a bit that whole taking a step back thing, which we're not very good at in work. Well, if your manager's coming in at 9:10 every morning to give you work, why would you start something at 9 o'clock? And she just looked at me and said, oh, I didn't think of that. And I think I laugh about that particular scenario, but it's just indicative of the kind of habitual thinking that we get into in the workplace. So we do things because we've always done them like that. And then we get frustrated when somebody doesn't quite fit in with our way of working, and actually turning that round and thinking, okay, how can I work within this, is a far healthier way of managing yourself as well as managing the situation.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And it's particularly interesting because the next question that I wanted to ask you was around self-awareness in management. But maybe we need self-awareness, but maybe we need other awareness too. That sounds like what you're saying.
I think we do. I think we need to be aware of ourselves, of our own triggers, of what motivates us, what interests us as a manager. Um, I often hear managers saying, well, I used to travel all over the country when I was looking for promotion. Why don't they want to do it? And well, they're not you, are they? They've got a different set of motivators and that drive them. So I think being aware of our own drivers is really important. But I think also what's even more important is understanding our team, each individual member of our team. What is it about them? What's their personal situation like? Have they got children that they've got to rush off for at the end of the working day, or have they got an elderly relative that they're looking after first thing in the morning, and it means that they can't come in early for meetings? Or are these people that can travel or can't travel? Or what is it about these people, and what is it that motivates each of those individuals? So there's partly about being aware of them, but then also being aware of what is it we say and do, and how is it that the way that we behave impacts on them. Can I see from I just said one thing to them and they just shut off completely, and well, what was that all about? How rude is that? And, well, what was it you said, and how did you say it, and what was the lead up to it, and what therefore can we draw as a conclusion about how that landed?
More of a leaning towards these sort of understandings with neurodiversity these days as well. Are you coming across that more? Because
Definitely.
I think it's much more of a highlight in the workspace these days than it ever has been.
Absolutely. And I think there's an expectation on managers that they will understand all of the implications of neurodiversity, and they might have 6 or 8 people in their team, and there might be 3 or 4 people in that team who are neurodiverse in different ways. So realistically, your average manager is not going to have an expert understanding of any of those things. I think if as individuals we can be curious and we can ask people, okay, well, what works best for you? How have you managed in a situation like this before? What sort of things were put in place to help you to achieve your potential? Then we have much more satisfying working relationships with people. I think there's always a thing with managers who have not had a management education tend to sort of hear the sound bites in the air. So I have to treat everyone the same is something I hear all the time, and I totally disagree. I think we have to treat everybody as individuals. We have to give everybody the same opportunities, but some people might need a bit of help to access those opportunities in the same way.
Yeah, and that's the same with children too. People just feel like they've got to treat their children exactly the same, but one child's got a very different need to another.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So they can use all these hints and tips and tools at home as well as in the workplace.
Definitely.
This leads us on to a really interesting point, and that's the balance really of performance and well-being for our team, because neurodiversity is becoming more and more of a thing. Well-being at work, thank God, is becoming more and more of a thing. But how does a manager balance the needs of the well-being of their team with the performance that they have to deliver? And can they feed each other?
So I like to think in terms of the formal definitions of stress as one indicator that well-being is not being achieved. So stress, is when pressure exceeds your body's ability to cope with it. Certain amounts of stress are good and they're motivating, and they make us work better. But if there's not enough stress, or if there's too much stress, we shut down, and you know that as well as anybody. Managers' roles are kind of twofold, because it is not just about driving everyone to perform. You've also got a responsibility to your team sometimes to say, actually, this isn't achievable. I don't have people with the right skills in the roles. I don't have enough of them. The deadlines aren't feasible. The kit that we've got to deliver this on just isn't appropriate. So to some extent, managers should be advocates for their team, and they do need to stand up and say, this is an unachievable goal. But on the other hand, we also need to teach people how to be as productive as possible when when we're up against it. Every business has deadlines and every business needs people to be able to pull out the stops. I think people can only pull out the stops when it's an occasional request, not a constant request. So, if you've got a team that is permanently under-resourced, you're really going to struggle to find an extra gear because people are already in top gear and they have been for quite some considerable time. So I think recognizing, what is the context, what are the particular circumstances that you're in? Have you got a team that are driven, motivated, focused? Do they understand what you need and how many or what quality or, what quantity of things that you actually need them to deliver? Have you got everything absolutely focused on that? And are you, as a manager, removing the barriers that are stopping them from actually working effectively and delivering what you need them to deliver? So I think there's quite a lot in there as managers, but I would say, number one, be realistic about your team and clear out the barriers, clear out the things that are getting in the way, but advocate for them as well, and sort of see if there are other ways of achieving that business goal.
You also stress the importance of a positive working environment and creating the right working environment. So what are some practical steps managers can take to achieve a good sort of working environment?
Well, I think the first thing to say is don't bother with the fruit bowls and the yoga mats and things like that, because that really isn't the starting point. I think working environment is one of those things that it's not a motivator in itself, but if it's not right, it is a demotivator. So that's Hertzberg's two-factor theory. There's a number of hygiene factors in a job, of which working environment's one, money's another, working condition, job conditions are another, that if they're not right, you'll never motivate people. They'll demotivate. And every employee is different, every workplace is different. So I would say to an employer who wants to improve the workplace, the first thing I would suggest you do is talk to your employees and ask them, what could we do to make this a better working environment for you? And I think quite often you'll be surprised, because it won't be the fruit bowl, it won't be soft music playing in the background. It might be, can I have a fan for my desk because I'm really hot? It might be, can I have a footrest because my knees ache every day when I sit here? Or, or it might be, could you put something on the door so it doesn't slam every time somebody walks into it? It could be really simple things like that, or it could be something more. But unless you ask your team, you're going to be spending a lot of money and wasting a lot of money on things that aren't going to make much of a difference.
Stephen Bartlett talks about this, doesn't he, with his big blue slide and his ball pool that nobody ever used, and it was mainly just a marketing tool.
Yeah, he did. He talked quite candidly recently about the fact that in his business he had over sort of 2,000 employees, and he'd given them all the material things that they could ever wish for. They had a basketball court, a pool table, a bar, hot pastries on a table, every day for anyone to help themselves with. And he said that was all great. And then suddenly we went into COVID and lockdowns, and all his employees were all sat on their laptops at home in their pants. And all of a sudden, that was an amazing leveler, because all of a sudden the bar didn't make any difference. The pool table didn't make any difference. It was the real things that the company had done, not the gimmicks and the pool tables.
I think an awful lot of employees just want to be listened to, actually. They just want somebody to say, what do you think? Take it on board and do something about it. And honestly, that it will make such a difference, and it usually doesn't cost an awful lot of money either.
Yeah.
Because most of them won't ask for the ball pool or the water slide or whatever. They just won't.
And we can again take that into our home life. If you're thinking about your partner and what they're thinking, or your kids, just ask and listen to what they're saying.
Yeah, absolutely.
It isn't that difficult. And
it'll never catch on, will it?
It is funny though, isn't it? Because people say to me and Matt all the time, oh, how do you two work so well together and you just seem to get on so well? I'm like, well, because we ask what each other needs. It's not difficult. Oh no, I'm not doing that.
They might tell me. They might not like it.
Yeah, and then I'd have to do something about it. Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah, we hear that quite a lot.
Yeah. Yeah, as well. So that's a great question. Challenging conversations.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So it's super tough for lots of people generally, let alone managers, to have or even start to approach challenging conversations that they know they need to have. But how do we start? What do we do?
So certainly in a managing context, the way we start is by preparing before we go in. So we do not go in like a bull in a china shop. We do not sort of just open our mouths and wait to see what comes out. We collect some evidence, because the first thing that's going to happen if you say to somebody, so in my world, we'll be typically talking about poor performance or behaviours that aren't appropriate in the workplace, or poor attendance. But let's talk about performance or behaviour. The first thing somebody's going to say, if you say to them, your performance hasn't been great recently, is, what do you mean? I thought I've been performing perfectly well. Nobody said anything. I assumed I was doing absolutely fine. So I think the scary thing, quite often, one of the scary things about a challenging conversation is that somebody's going to argue back with you and you're not going to know what to say. Well, if you've got all your evidence in front of you and you kind of understand it, you've seen the context of it, then that puts you in a far stronger position to be able to deal with the arguments or the challenges that come back. So I would say that first. Think about, what is the evidence I've got and what am I trying to achieve from this conversation? And write down some bullet points, because you are not going to remember. You're in a stressful situation, you're definitely not going to remember the very sensible structure that you might have thought about before you went into the meeting. Most people need to understand what is the performance gap. So you need to have prepared that beforehand as well. If you're saying to somebody you're underperforming, well, I need to know, where do I sit? Am I like an inch away from where I should be? Am I 3 feet away from where I should be? What is that performance gap? And then we need to sit down and actually have the conversation with them. And, I've got used to over 30 years in HR. I do have a box of tissues with me because people might react in ways I don't expect. So, be ready for the unexpected. They might be angry, they might cry. I'm not sure which is worse. They both feel really uncomfortable. But I've always found, I used to think I was a very nervous and uncourageous manager when I would sit down with people and ask them to self-assess first. So I'd kind of say, talk to me about how you think you're performing recently. And I used to think that was a real cop-out. And actually, I have since learned that is one of the most powerful questions you can ask people, because you then get their self-assessment and you can actually see how hard you need to come in with your challenge back to them. So if they say, well, I think I'm doing fairly well over here, but on this particular area I am really struggling, I don't understand what I'm supposed to be doing here, or I'm not getting the information in from, then you can start to have a proper conversation about how do we put that right? How do we remove those barriers? How do we give you the training that you need? How do we sort of ensure that the rest of the team are communicating appropriately with you so that you can deliver this? But if you don't start with that, you may well go in with, your performance is unacceptable and this can't continue, and this is a formal warning and we need to do something under these scary HR procedures that can take forever to get through. And it's so unnecessary. So having that preparation up front, but also being humble enough to actually ask somebody to self-assess first, I think is a really good approach.
What happens if it's like a more personal issue, like body odor, bad breath, that sort of thing?
Oh, they always get thrown to HR, don't they? I always used to ask these questions on training courses, and then the answer was always send it back to HR.
But what does HR do?
Well, HR just kind of go, we don't know what to say either.
So is that a situation you ignore? Because it creates a terrible working environment.
No, and I think, I see people going in all sorts of different ways. Let's put some toiletries in the bathrooms. Well, that doesn't usually work because the person that needs it most really doesn't recognise it. So sometimes you have to just be direct with people, and it may be a case of saying, I would want to know, first of all, is this something that's always been a problem, or is it a change recently? Because that can indicate perhaps they're on some medication or they've had some problem in their life that we don't necessarily know about, that means they're having problems. But I would sit down and say, actually, it's been noticed, that your clothes just don't smell quite as fresh as they have done in the past, or, that I was wondering if you've got any problems with, have you got enough workwear? Do you need, have you got problems with washing things or what have you? And just try and have a conversation around that way. And I've seen people who've sort of said, oh, I've had no hot water for 3 weeks, and my mum's doing my washing and I just haven't been able to get round to her. Or people with dogs who don't realise necessarily that letting your dog sleep on your washing probably isn't the best the best way to keep it as fresh as possible. But there's all sorts of reasons, and some of them are medical. Sometimes it is medication that people have been given. So again, we kind of have to tread carefully, I think, and just ask gently, curiously, without prejudging.
Yeah,
I think coming out of difficult questions, sometimes a person is just not the right fit for a team, are they? And they really shouldn't be there. Are there some common warning signs of that with new employees, and how do managers sort of tackle that?
So if I'm entirely honest with you, Matt, in every single case I've ever come across where this has happened, the manager knew during recruitment that there was a problem.
Yeah.
So there was something that set an alarm bell ringing, where they kind of, not entirely sure of this, but generally speaking, they needed someone quickly. So, needed the bums on the seats. So I thought I'd just take a chance. And you're always right. Your gut feeling at interview is nearly always right, actually. So I think if some of the signs that you might see very early on, somebody who persuaded you that they were up to the job, and that you can see their performance just isn't quite where it should have been. Somebody who just doesn't gel with the rest of the team, who just kind of, you need a little bit of time to work out, are they just a bit nervous and socially awkward, or is this a bigger issue that isn't something that's going to kind of go away? But I think also the people that say it's never their fault are the ones that I would be most sort of concerned about. I always say to managers, you need to hire slowly and you need to fire quickly.
Yeah.
So you take your time over recruiting people. There are lots of people looking for jobs, and not as many as there have been, but there are lots of people. And the wrong hire is more expensive for your business than no hire at all, because the management time it's going to take you to train that person to realise they're not right for the job and get rid of them, even if you're really slick at it, is still taking time away from your business.
It can take years.
Absolutely. It can absolutely take years. And the bigger the organisation, the more chance there is that they'll be pushed around from department to department and nobody will actually ever deal with them. But we have a new government in the UK, and one of the things they are talking about is bringing in unfair dismissal rights from day one, with the exception of a probationary period. So if we're allowed to have, say, a 6-month probationary period, that is really the time in which we need to be really hot on what we expect from somebody during that period, and monitoring their performance and giving them feedback and making quick decisions, and not leaving it to hang on for 18 months before you decide, I can't be coping with this.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because I was going to ask you, because you said there, hire slow, fire quick, which makes complete sense. But I hear so many business leaders saying, we just can't get rid of problem staff, because, we're trapped because they're going to take us to a tribunal, or, but that's really interesting what you then led on to, which was deal with it all in the probationary period.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think, there's I hear a lot of business owners saying, employees have all the power, we can't do anything, we're scared of a tribunal. The risk of you actually being taken to an employment tribunal is actually vanishingly small for most small businesses. There's around about 130,000 employment tribunal new claims each year, and that's been fairly stable the last 4 or 5 years. And there's something like 28 million employees. So the chances of your employee taking you to a tribunal are pretty small. That's not to say it's impossible, and you do need to follow fair processes. You need to follow your own processes. You need to make sure that if somebody's got a protected characteristic under the Equality Act, that you deal with them very carefully, because they have employment protection rights from day one, regardless of whether they're on probation or not. But as long as you are training people well, making your expectations clear, monitoring their performance, giving them feedback and an opportunity to improve, and they're not improving, then you can dismiss them during probation. It is not going to be a problem, and they are not going to be able to win a tribunal case. I'm not saying they won't take you to a tribunal, because we can't control what ex-employees do, but it's very unlikely that they will win a case.
Yeah, fascinating. Thanks.
Back to micromanagers. Delegation is often a real problem for managers, particularly the accidental manager. How can they delegate more effectively?
So I think the problem we usually have with delegation is we try and do it when we're really busy, and we don't delegate, we dump. So we just chuck stuff at people and just say, do your best with that, because I haven't got time to do it. And then we kind of don't check up on how they're doing. We just leave them to it. And then when they haven't met their deadline, that's it. They're awful. They're terrible. You know, they're not done it the way we would have done it and whatever. So there are ways that you can delegate that are much more effective. One of the things that you really need to do is plan ahead. So you need to be thinking in your quieter times, you know, what are the things in my job that take a lot of my time, I don't necessarily need to do myself, because, you know, they could be done by somebody else. And they would be interesting for someone else to do. So I'm not just going to dump all the rubbish on them, but something that'd be interesting, that would be developmental for somebody else to do, would be a good sort of task to pick. So we plan ahead, we pick the task, we decide which person we're going to try and delegate it to. And then we need to build some time in to actually tell them what we want them to do, maybe give them a little bit of training and support, maybe take them stage by stage through this activity. So we might break it down into chunks, and we might give them one chunk first, let them get confident with doing that, and then we give them the next chunk, and we give them some feedback on how they've done with that. So this all takes time.
I was just thinking, you're going to have the manager that's going to say, oh, but it's quicker to do it myself.
Absolutely. It is quicker to do it yourself the first time, but actually, if you think that this person can then do that task for you week after week after week, or month after month after month, then actually the investment in the short term is going to pay you dividends as you go through time. So I think once you've kind of educated somebody and made sure that they're competent to do the task, you need to give it to them and set some milestones, so you have some regular reviews. So the biggest mistake we make is that we say to people, right, I need you to write this report. It's got to be with my senior manager on Friday afternoon. So get it to me by Friday lunchtime so that I can meet that deadline. And you don't see it from the day you give it to the person to the Friday lunchtime. And then on Friday lunchtime, it's a nightmare, because they've got it all wrong and they've not done exactly what you wanted them to do. But if we had a check-in with them, say on Tuesday morning, we could see if they were going wrong, and we could say to them, you know, well, we need to do this differently. I'll help you to do that bit. We'll pull this around. And if we have another check-in with them on Thursday, then we know that for Friday lunchtime, this thing's going to be absolutely fine. So it's those check-ins that are the most important thing. It's timing them to make sure that we are there with enough time to put things right if the employee can't do it themselves. And then I think that the last thing I would sort of say, and I will say about delegation, is you have to trust people. You have to accept that they are going to do it a bit different to you, but you need to trust them to get on with it. And if it goes wrong, it's not their fault. It's your fault. So you have to kind of forget the blame game, and you have to take that responsibility yourself. So, you know, it does work. Most managers who delegate absolutely fly, because, you know, they've freed up lots of their own time to do other more value-adding things. So don't let the sort of timing put you off. Just choose times when you know your business is naturally a bit quieter to start the process of teaching people what you want them to eventually take on.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. We see a similar thing in our line of work, where clients have gone to outsource graphic designers, say, or website designers and things to build assets for their business. And they didn't get what they wanted, or they didn't get the results they wanted, and it's nearly always down to the quality and how specific the brief was.
Yep.
That was given. And quite often the brief isn't specific, because they don't really know what they want or need. They just know that when it's delivered, it's not what they wanted.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's that's a really fascinating parallel between because I suppose when you're outsourcing, that is delegation as well. So
yeah, I used to have a manager though. I can remember writing reports for him, and then he'd say, "Oh, I want you to change that, and I want you to." Turn around to him and say, but that was exactly what you asked for. I said, yes, I know, but now I've seen it. Now I know I didn't want that. I wanted something completely different. But at least he had the guts to actually say that, rather than make me think I'd sort of somehow not been a mind reader and not realised what he really wanted.
Yeah, and that's
absolutely.
a brilliant point as well. As a manager, you have to take responsibility. Yes. You cannot palm stuff off on other people just because. What's the single most important piece of advice you'd give to a new accidental manager out there who sat going, oh, I really don't like this?
I would say you can learn management skills. There are so many management schools out there. There are management qualifications you can do. If you couldn't learn to be a manager, they would all be out of business. So it is something you can learn to do. But don't try and change the world overnight. So, if you're new into a role and you're not liking it, take a step back and just think about, am I clear what my role is? That's always the place to start. And most people aren't. And they need a conversation with their manager to get that clarity about what they should be doing. And then they need to speak to the teams and just kind of get to grips with, what is the team struggling with? Where could you actually make a difference? Don't just kind of go in with your size 9 and just kind of, try and change the world overnight. You don't need to do that. You're in this for the long haul. So actually do it with your team. They'd much rather work with you in most cases and have you solve the problems they've got. They probably know better than you do what those problems are. So get them to sort of tell you what the problems are and then make a plan and just tackle that plan in order. But I think that just going back to, are you really clear what your role is, or are you trying to do everything and doing it all badly is always the starting point.
Yeah.
Would you say, I'm guessing so, but I'm just going to check. Would you say that was the same advice for a solo business owner who suddenly needs to take on people and has started to employ their first couple of employees?
I think I do a lot of work with small business owners in that position, and a lot of it is around being really clear up front. What kind of business do I want to run? What do I want it to feel like when I walk in the mornings? How do I want people to behave to each other? How do I want us to talk to each other? And really being specific about that, because that's your values, that's your culture, that's the working environment you're trying to create. And if you can be really clear on that before you start recruiting, really clear on what you want your new recruit to do, you can find the person that fits. You can generally teach them most of the skills, but you can't train attitude, personality. Those come with the individual. So you need to be really clear up front. What is it I'm looking for? What kind of persons can I work well with? And who's going to add something to my business? Perhaps add some qualities I don't have. Maybe is a good place to start.
Do you think it's really important, particularly with the smaller businesses, to have a real purpose and mission and values within the organization that they can rally the team around?
Absolutely. I think absolutely. I don't think we'd necessarily always call it that. I think we might shy away from writing it down and having this sort of mission and vision and values statements everywhere. But I think actually we run our businesses in line with our values. And if we could just take a step back and maybe reflect with a coach on how we like to do business with our customers, what we consider good service to be, what we consider, a good working environment to look like, we could get some help to actually articulate what those are and share them with our teams. The whole thing about going to work for an employer is I want to go and work. I'm going to do my best work if I work for somewhere that shares my values, where I can actually buy into the way they want to work, because I think that's the right way to work as well. And if I don't like the way that Q Branch Consulting operate, well, that's okay, because there'll be other companies who operate very differently where I will fit much better.
And I think that's
feel
the thing
happier.
from both sides is I always say it's like dating when you're looking for somebody. It's about getting the right person for the job, not 10 people who might be okay.
Yes,
It's about
absolutely.
getting one person that's going to really fit. So don't be scared to put people off.
Yes,
and the same as employment. I think people get so scared that they're not going to find a job that they'll just take anything and accept anything and be treated in any way just because they need to pay bills. And actually, there is always a job out there that will fit.
yes, absolutely. I totally agree. And I think I always call recruitment the kind of the dance of the lies. It's like who can tell the most fibs or withhold the most information that would really actually help the other person make a decision whether they want the job. But we fib about it, or we withhold information because we just want someone, and sometimes the employer is as desperate as the employee for someone to just fill a post.
Yeah.
And that's where the nightmare starts, really.
Yeah, absolutely. So you've coached many accidental managers. Can you share one or a couple of real success stories of where things have really turned around?
Yeah, so I think, and I'm probably going to repeat some of the things I've talked about earlier. I think the one I referred to last year is my star pupil. I'll talk about that individual. And they had been promoted through the ranks. So they'd started with this organisation from school, and they'd literally been promoted all the way up through the organisation into the most senior management role. So they reported into a board of directors, and they'd never had any management training whatsoever. And I was asked to come and work with them because, the board said, this person works their socks off. We can see it. We know they're busy. They're just not delivering the things that we need them to be delivering. And it's quite a common story, really. And, sitting down with this individual, and we had the conversation about, what is it you actually do all day? Then? Talk me through an average day. And there were an awful lot of examples of times when this person was kind of helping, or we might say micromanaging, some people in their teams, so kind of jumping in and solving those problems because those problems were easy things to solve, because this individual had done those jobs before. They knew how to do that work. Actually doing the job of a manager, that's hard, that's scary. They've not done that before. So, they kind of reverted to their comfort zone. So we had the conversation about you do realise you're making them look good, don't you? And you're not. And then we kind of got a bit deeper into what was really going on. So we'd got some underperformance issues that needed to be dealt with. We'd got some issues around structure and use of time, and where this individual was actually devoting their working time. And we talked through some of that, and we worked out what kind of percentage of time they should be spending on different things. We worked out, and some of where my coaching kind of flips into teaching is that these performance issues, they had really no idea how to deal with them. So we kind of talked through a process. Now, quite sometimes when I coach people, we'll have these conversations, and I'll go away, and when I come back the next time, we can say, well, how did you get on? Oh, I didn't have any time. But this individual was different, because this individual said, no, I did the thing you said with the poor performer. I've had these conversations, and they've got these notes from all the conversations they'd had. And I've set these targets, and we worked through a performance management plan with this individual. And to cut a long story short, this person went from working 60 to 70 hours a week down to working 40 hours a week. They had delivered 3 or 4 massive infrastructure projects for their organisation through this period. And their poor performers, one of them had left of their own accord, recognising that this wasn't the job for them. And the second one had kind of said, I don't know what I want to do, and had some career coaching to help them decide what to do. Now, you might think, well, you've just got rid of 2 employees, and how's that helped a manager? But actually, it did help, because it meant they could recruit the right people to fill those positions eventually. And I think I could tell you so many stories of people like this who've kind of just turned around a team. They've grown some skills in terms of, okay, I know what to say to people. I know how to look someone in the eye and say performance isn't up to scratch, and these are the things I need you to do. And I know it's not going to be easy, and I know I'm going to feel horrible, but actually this is the job I'm employed to do. And they can fly. and they can fly in those situations. The coach is very specific to the problems you have. So, if next year they have a problem and they want to look at recruitment, then that's something I can go in and help them with, and we will build those management skills as and when people need them.
There will be lots of people out there who are accidental managers, or they're building a team, and they will be going, right, we need a Marian in our group. So we'll put all your details in the show notes so that people can contact you.
Lovely, thank you.
Because I think everybody needs a Marian.
Yeah, everyone should have access to a Marian. Absolutely. So we're going to sort of round up there, but this is my favourite part of the show because I get to be a Radio 4 presenter.
Okay.
And we're going to take you to a Desert Island Discs moment. Could you give us one book, one piece of music, and a single tool or framework that has made a big impact on your career that you would like to share with our viewers?
So when I started in my very first role for BT, I was very shy, very quiet, and I didn't want to speak to anybody. And my boss gave me a very, very old copy of How to Win Friends and Influence People. Honestly, that book changed my life. It's a really old-fashioned book. It's really hard to kind of get into, but it gave me so many hints and tips about how to be interested in people and ask questions and get them to talk. And that stops me feeling all nervous and what. But it's such a good skill to have, I think, as you go through life. So that was the book that changed me. Piece of music. The one that springs to mind is when I went off for my very first interview for my first management position, and One Moment in Time by Whitney Houston came on, and I used to play that on repeat. Back in the old days of cassette players in cars, I used to have to play it, rewind it, play it, rewind it, play it, rewind it, all the way from my office in Headingley to wherever it was I was being interviewed in Leeds. I had to go back a couple of times for different stages of the process. So it's always, that one always brings a smile to my face when I hear it. And then a framework, I guess the one I probably use the most is Hursty and Blanchard's situational leadership model. So it's a model that really describes the different management styles you should use depending on the knowledge and the motivation of the person that you're coaching at the time. And it's such an eye-opener for managers to understand that, there are different approaches we use depending on how long someone's been in the job, how much knowledge they've got, how much skill they've got, how motivated they are. And you can be a directing manager, or you can be a coaching manager, or a supporting manager, or a delegating manager. And if you use the wrong style, that might be why you're getting the wrong reactions from the people in your teams. It's such a simple model with such a lot of applications.
Yeah, sounds great.
Yeah, we're going to put a link to some information about that in the show notes as well for anyone who's interested. Brilliant. Thank you so much, Marion. It's been brilliant to sit and chat about people and managers and things with you today. Thank you for sharing so much experience from the largest companies to the smallest companies. Yeah, it's been fantastic.
Yep, I really enjoyed it.
Thank you very much. I've loved being here. Thank you.
Quick one before you go. If you want to grab a free PDF download copy of my new book, Being Bold, How to Use Brand and Human Transformation to Skyrocket Your Growth, just drop into the show notes where I'll put a link to your free copy.